Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm from New York, and so it's, well, I don't know if I'm that excited to admit that, but it's very restorative, let's say, to be in the room full of people from saner places. So I'm very happy to be here. I often ask myself how we got here, to this point, where American parents have to organize themselves in defense of their children against the state. A state convinced its role is to dictate rather than represent the interests of its citizens. In Ernest Hemingway's 1926 novel, The Sun Also Rises, one character asks another how he went bankrupt. The reply is gradually, then suddenly. That seems to fit here as well. The incremental encroachments on our freedoms were mostly overlooked as they piled up over the years. Then the pandemic riveted the attention of millions of Americans who realized that suddenly, in everything, from their speech to their movements to the education of their children, they were no longer free. The question that interests me even more than how this all happened, though, is why some people accept it and others resist. I'd always assumed that freedom was the deepest yearning of the soul, that man would always choose liberty over submission. In my community, the Jewish community, the holiday of Passover, which commemorates the ancient Israelites' liberation from Egyptian bondage, is the most celebrated Jewish holiday in America. This was the historical moment when the Jews were free to become a nation with a set of laws and a mission that would define its destiny. Freedom is at the center of our national narrative, and the language of this seminal historical moment has been used to describe the aspirations of generations of those seeking freedom. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin proposed that the seal of the United States depict Moses leading his people across the Red Sea. African Americans interpreted their struggle to end slavery through references to the Exodus story. Freedom was always one of the highest human values and Jewish values, as I understood it. That understanding was tested, however, by what I saw during the lockdowns and during all of the social and political unrest that followed. I realized that for some, liberty is negotiable. Many don't see it as a divine inheritance, but as a commodity that can be traded for government protection, for social acceptance, for convenience, for profit. Dennis Prager spoke last night about the Israelites who left Egypt and wanted to go back, but Jewish tradition also teaches us that a certain percentage of the people actually refused to participate in the Exodus at all. They actually never left. They may have lived in bondage, but there was certainty in their enslavement. In the wilderness, there was freedom, but there were no guarantees. Not everyone is up for freedom. It's hard, it's a responsibility. So what is it about the people who choose it and choose to fight for it? What do they understand that others don't? There are likely many answers to this question, but one of them is found, I think, in the Hebrew word for liberty itself. Hebrew words have 2 or 3 letter roots, which often refer back to an Old Testament usage. When that textual context is understood, it adds new depth to the concept the word is trying to express, and it makes the communication of the underlying idea exponentially more powerful. The modern Hebrew word for liberty is cherut. The word is taken from Exodus 32:16. God's inscription of the 10 Commandments on the stone tablets is described as charut, or engraved. Interestingly, there are 2 other words for freedom in the Bible that associate directly with liberation from slavery. They would have been the more obvious choices for the modern term, but it was the word engraved that was chosen. Why? Our rabbis suggest that while freedom from restriction and coercion is critical, it isn't the highest form of human liberty. People need to be freed from bondage so that they can orient themselves towards something that affirms their humanity and elevates the soul. For the rabbis, that something is connection with the divine, made available through God's words engraved on the tablets. That is where true liberty is found. Said another way, all of you aren't just fighting against government intrusion on family life or against the indoctrination of your children, though these are critical battles. You are really fighting for the sanctity of the parent-child bond and for the unleashing of your children's boundless potential. That's a different kind of motivation. It isn't paralyzing but inspiring. The risks associated with being free remain, but they are worth taking. For some, freedom is more than a right. It is a mission engraved into the divine covenant of man, and there is nothing they would trade it for. I think there is a yearning for real liberty in all of us, but we have to understand its source and be able to access it. Creating obstacles to that access is the power-hungry state's mission. It always begins by attacking our speech, because our words and our thoughts connect us to our souls, the source of our freedom. Once that channel is disrupted, the untethered soul lives in chaos and confusion. Disconnected and lost, people will make shocking bargains with their new rulers just to feel anchored into something. They will double mask their kids on the soccer field and teach their children about their white privilege and black disempowerment while dutifully replacing their own speech with the state's propaganda. The virus stops here, or I pledge to do better. We all heard people mouthing these mantras and so many others. They turned their autonomy in at the door. The reward was freedom from social exclusion and cancellation, but it was a terrible trade. Only people with open hearts and battered souls would make it. Nowhere has this disruption of the soul worked more perniciously than through the activist transgender movement, which has attempted to redefine language and reality altogether. The effects have been devastating for young people, many of whom learn to erase who they are and then voluntarily turn themselves over for refashioning and a new label. The tactic is to manipulate speech, but the strategic goal is always to subdue the soul. The battle against the false category of hate speech, for instance, disguises itself as a righteous endeavor, but it is really a way to control what we can and cannot say. As a Jewish woman, I am particularly sensitive to this device, as it is so often deployed on my behalf to protect my Jewish rights, even as it abuses my American ones. Hate speech, of course, is always in the eye of the beholder, and Jews should know better than most that once there is a list, we will inevitably find ourselves on it. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, similarly, is an insidious scheme with a halo on its head. It pretends to reach out to marginalized communities, but it is really a way to marginalize everyone and have them turn to government for protection. The fight is unrelenting. It can be exhausting, but it has to be fought in every instance, every time it shows up at our doors. About a year ago, I took my twin teenagers to their pediatrician in Manhattan. After their appointments, both my son and my daughter told me about the conversation they had with their doctor. She asked which pronouns they preferred, questioned their level of comfort with their gender, and even suggested to my son that he consider switching from his Jewish day school, which does not inject Jewish gender identity into his curriculum, to another Jewish school which does. Fortunately, my then 15-year-olds weren't susceptible to the message. They both simply rolled their eyes. I didn't. I didn't. I called the doctor and asked her not to discuss the subject with my children again, as our family does not believe gender is an identity. I thought that would end the conversation, but it didn't. Amazingly, she pushed back, trying to persuade me that this was what was best for my children. They need a safe space to talk about these things, she advised me, though I hadn't asked for her advice. I explained to her that their father and I were my children's safe space, not the pediatrician they see twice a year. Not the pediatrician that they see twice a year, whose first name, by the way, they don't even know. I found a new pediatrician 1 week later. I still marvel at the mindset, or maybe the soul's condition, of a doctor so consumed by an ideology that she could no longer recognize biology, boundaries, or even basic human decency. I almost felt sorry for her when I heard her robotically repeat the words gender identity and safe space, as if she had just read them from the groupthink manual. how disconnected she had become, how captured. Fighting back against the toxic messaging that permeates our society is our first job as parents, but I believe that more than pulling our children away from the chaos, we are tasked with reorienting them back toward something that is stable and elevating. In order to do that, you have to practice it before the crisis comes. It's a muscle that needs conditioning. In many Jewish homes, it's a tradition for parents to bless their children at the Friday night Sabbath table each week with the priestly blessing taken from the Book of Numbers. Interestingly, it isn't a prayer for good crops or military victory, both of which would have been useful to the ancient Israelites at the time. It's a 3-line outpouring of hope for God's protection, brought about through a direct encounter with him. The Hebrew is beautiful. Twice, God is asked to raise up or illuminate his anthropomorphic face to those in receipt of the blessing. Today, too, we don't ask God to bless our children with the long list of outcomes we as parents want for them, or we shouldn't. Not for perfect SAT scores or for the right words to pop into their brains when someone demands they use a preferred pronoun. We ask that God would show them his face. We want our children to know their source intimately. That will be all the protection they need. That will fortify their souls. That will produce the right outcomes, the right words, and resistance to those trying to suppress them. If the 20th century writer and thinker Alexander Solzhenitsyn were alive today, he might say that what is needed is a stable nucleus. He used this amazing phrase to describe the condition of the soul that allowed some of his fellow prisoners in the Soviet Gulag to retain their humanity in the midst of Marxist corruption and the depravity it bred. It is so powerfully put. To me, it describes an inner equilibrium and a cellular level of commitment to human sanctity that no external force can conquer. That's what I want for myself and for my children. It is inspiring to see that so many Americans still know that the state is not their higher power. They have stable nuclei. I am joining them and leaning on the spiritual force they have created because I don't see how we overcome this enormous challenge without it. I sent my children to a Jewish day school because I thought it would hermetically seal them off from these challenges. It has certainly helped, but sadly, we have not been immune. Of course, one of the lessons of being a parent is that there is no magic force field you can build around your children. You are the force field. Sometimes when pessimism sets in, I watch videos online of parents in this room, standing at the microphone at the local school board meeting, speaking quickly as the digital clock ticks away in front of you. Sometimes your mics are cut, and often members of the board interrupt you and attempt to silence you. I look at you and the parents packed in the seats behind you, and I think of all the other things you had to do that evening, all the happier ways you could have spent those hours. But you show up and you do the work, and it isn't convenient or easy. I want to say that I really admire you. I hope you know that millions of people like me are watching you and drawing inspiration from what you do. Thank you very much for having me, and enjoy your breakfast.